At 6:42 a.m. on a freezing January morning inside one of Alabama's most notorious correctional facilities, an inmate was found dead in his cell. His name was Jerome Davis, 29 years old, serving 10 years for armed robbery. But what investigators uncovered inside that cold concrete cell would expose a secret that no one, not the guards, not the state officials, not even the families involved, was ready for. The rumor had been spreading through the prison like wildfire for weeks. Whispers in the chow line, coded messages passed between cells, guards looking the other way when certain names were mentioned. Everyone knew something had happened between the warden and Jerome Davis. Something forbidden. Something that crossed every line that exists between power and prisoner. But no one could have predicted it would end like this. With a body on the floor, a career destroyed, and a truth so dark it would shake the entire Alabama Department of Corrections to its core. This is the story of what happens when authority breaks down behind bars, when loneliness turns into obsession, and when one moment of humiliation becomes a death sentence. This is the story of Jerome Davis and Warden Patricia Hail. Welcome to Silent Witness, True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. The Limestone Correctional Facility sits in the rural flatlands of northern Alabama, about 30 miles from the Tennessee border. It's not the kind of place that makes headlines often. It's medium security, housing around 1,500 inmates, mostly men serving sentences for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and parole violations. The facility is old, built in the early 70s, and it shows. The paint peels off the walls in long strips. The air conditioning barely works in the Alabama summer. The bars are rusted in places, and the smell of bleach, sweat, and something sour hangs in the air no matter what time of day it is. This is where people are sent to disappear, to serve their time quietly and hope that when they get out, the world hasn't forgotten them completely. For the guards and staff, it's just a job, a paycheck. You clock in, you keep order, you clock out. You don't get emotionally involved, you don't make friends with inmates, and you sure as hell don't let your guard down. That's the rule. That's what keeps you safe. But rules, as we'll see, are only as strong as the people who enforce them. Warden Patricia Hail had been working in the Alabama prison system for 15 years before she was promoted to warden at Limestone. She was 42 years old, a woman who had clawed her way up through a male-dominated system with discipline, intelligence, and an iron will. Patricia didn't smile much. She didn't engage in small talk. She ran her facility like a military operation, every rule followed to the letter, every infraction met with swift consequence. She believed in order. She believed in structure. And she believed that if you showed weakness, even for a second, the entire system would collapse around you. Patricia had been married once, back in her 20s, to a man she met in college. It didn't last. The job consumed her. The long hours, the emotional toll, the constant weight of responsibility. He wanted a wife who came home at 5:30 and cooked dinner. She wanted a career. So they divorced, and Patricia threw herself even deeper into her work. She lived alone in a small house about 20 minutes from the prison. No pets, no hobbies, just work, sleep, and the occasional glass of wine on the porch while she stared at nothing in particular. She told herself she was fine. She told herself she didn't need anyone. But loneliness has a way of creeping in, even when you build walls to keep it out. Jerome Davis arrived at Limestone Correctional Facility in the spring of that year. He was 29, tall, lean, with dark eyes, and a smile that seemed out of place behind bars. Jerome had been sentenced to 10 years for armed robbery. He and two friends had held up a gas station outside Mobile. No one was hurt, but the judge made an example out of them. Jerome's friends took plea deals. Jerome went to trial and lost. He'd already served 2 years at another facility before being transferred to Limestone due to overcrowding. And from the moment he stepped off that bus, shackled at the ankles and wrists, something about him was different. He didn't have the hard, empty look that most inmates carry. He didn't walk with his head down. He made eye contact. He smiled. He said thank you to the guards who processed him. Some of them thought he was mocking them. Others thought he was naive, that prison hadn't broken him yet. But Jerome wasn't naive. He was smart. He knew how to read people. He knew that in a place like this, your attitude could be the difference between survival and becoming a target. And he also knew that sometimes the people with the most power are the loneliest. He saw that in Warden Patricia Hail the first time she walked past his cell during morning rounds. It started with paperwork. Jerome had filed a request to enroll in the prison's educational program. He wanted to finish his GED, maybe take some college courses. The request came across Patricia's desk, and she approved it without much thought. But then Jerome showed up to her office one afternoon with a follow-up question about the curriculum. The guard escorted him in, and Patricia looked up from her desk to see this inmate standing there, polite, well-spoken, asking intelligent questions about literature and history. They talked for maybe 10 minutes. When he left, Patricia found herself thinking about the conversation longer than she should have. A week later, Jerome requested a meeting again, this time about a grievance another inmate had filed against him. Patricia handled it personally. Again, they talked, this time for 20 minutes. She noticed the way he listened, really listened when she spoke. The way he asked about her day, like he genuinely cared. No one had asked her that in years. The meetings became more frequent. Patricia told herself it was part of her job, that she was just being thorough, making sure a model inmate stayed on the right path. But the truth was, she started looking forward to those meetings. She started scheduling them later in the day, when fewer staff were around. And Jerome, he knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't manipulating her, not exactly, but he wasn't stopping it either. It was a Tuesday night in late June when everything changed. Patricia had stayed late to finish some reports. Most of the staff had gone home. The night shift guards were making their rounds, but they were predictable, mechanical. Patricia knew their patterns by heart. She found herself walking toward cell block C where Jerome was housed. She told herself she was just doing a random inspection. But when she stopped in front of cell 214 and Jerome looked up from the book he was reading, they both knew why she was really there. She unlocked the cell, she stepped inside, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Patricia Hail let her guard down. They didn't say much at first, just looked at each other. Then Jerome stood up, walked over to her, and touched her hand. Just a simple touch, fingers brushing against fingers. But in that moment, 15 years of loneliness, of walls built so high she couldn't see over them anymore, came crashing down. She kissed him. He kissed her back. And what happened next would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. The affair continued for weeks. Patricia would visit Jerome's cell 2, sometimes 3 times a week, always late at night, always when the cameras in that section were conveniently malfunctioning. She had access to the security system. She knew how to erase footage. She knew which guards she could trust to look the other way, and which ones she needed to keep in the dark. Jerome, for his part, played his role perfectly. He was discreet. He didn't brag to other inmates. He didn't ask for special treatment during the day. In public, they barely acknowledged each other. But behind that cell door, in the darkness, they were something else entirely. Patricia convinced herself it was love, that this wasn't just some reckless, self-destructive mistake, that Jerome saw her, really saw her, in a way no one else ever had. But Jerome's feelings were more complicated. He cared about Patricia, in his own way. But he also knew that this relationship was his ticket to an easier life behind bars, extra privileges, protection, maybe even an early release if he played his cards right. He never said that out loud, but deep down they both knew the truth. Then came the night everything fell apart. It was mid-August, oppressively hot even at midnight. Patricia had come to Jerome's cell like usual. They were together in the way they'd been together dozens of times before, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the stress of keeping the secret. Maybe it was just bad luck. But in the middle of their encounter, as Patricia was on top of him, vulnerable in every sense of the word. Jerome looked down and saw something he hadn't noticed before. A scar. An abnormality. Something that caught him so off guard that before he could stop himself, he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a mocking laugh, just a nervous, surprised, involuntary laugh. But Patricia heard it. And in that moment, everything she'd been feeling, all the shame, all the fear, all the self-loathing she'd been pushing down for weeks, came flooding to the surface. She froze. Her face went cold. She pulled away from him, scrambling to get dressed, her hands shaking. Jerome tried to apologize, tried to explain, but she wasn't listening. She was already out the door, the cell lock slamming behind her. She didn't say a word. She just walked away, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. And Jerome sat there in the dark, knowing he'd just made a terrible, irreversible mistake. By the next morning, the entire prison knew something had happened. Not the details, not yet, but enough. Inmates have a way of sensing shifts in power, changes in the air. They saw the way Patricia moved through the facility, her face like stone, her eyes hollow. They saw the way Jerome stayed quiet in the yard, keeping to himself, his usual confidence gone. And they started talking. The rumors spread fast. Some said Jerome had blackmailed the warden. Others said she'd caught him with contraband and was planning to have him transferred to a maximum security facility. But a few inmates, the ones who paid close attention, who noticed which cameras went dark and when, they knew the truth. Or at least, they knew enough. One inmate, a guy named Marcus, who'd been at Limestone for 6 years, confronted Jerome in the showers. Quiet, casual, like they were just talking about the weather. He asked Jerome if the rumors were true. Jerome denied it, but Marcus just smiled and said, "Man, you better hope she don't decide you know too much." Patricia, meanwhile, was unraveling. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that moment, heard that laugh, felt that humiliation all over again. She'd risked everything for Jerome, her career, her reputation, her freedom. And in 1 second, he'd made her feel like a joke. She started avoiding him completely. When she had to walk past his cell, she kept her eyes straight ahead. When his name came up in reports, she handed them off to her deputy warden. She tried to bury herself in work, in routine, in anything that would help her forget. But the anger kept building, not just at Jerome, at herself, for being so stupid, for thinking that someone like him could actually care about someone like her, for breaking every rule she'd ever believed in. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Jerome was a problem, a loose end, a threat. He knew everything. He could destroy her with a single conversation, and if the wrong person started asking questions, if internal affairs got involved, it would all come out. The affair, the security footage, the abuse of power. She'd lose her job. She'd face criminal charges. She might even end up in a cell herself. 3 weeks after that night, Patricia made a decision. She couldn't let this continue. She couldn't let Jerome hold this over her. She needed to take control. She started looking into ways to have Jerome transferred, maybe to a facility out of state, somewhere far away where he couldn't talk to anyone who mattered. But the transfer process was slow, bureaucratic. It would take months. And she didn't have months. The rumors were getting louder. One of her guards, a woman named Denise, who'd worked under Patricia for 5 years, pulled her aside one afternoon and asked, point blank, if something was going on between her and Jerome Davis. Patricia denied it, of course, but Denise didn't look convinced. 2 days later, Denise put in for a transfer to another facility. When Patricia asked why, Denise just said she needed a change, but Patricia knew the truth. Denise suspected something, and if Denise suspected, others did too. The walls were closing in. Then came the phone call. Late one night, Patricia's personal cell phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. It was Jerome. Somehow he'd gotten access to a contraband phone. He was calling from his cell, his voice low, urgent. He told her they needed to talk, that he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt her. Patricia listened in silence. Then Jerome said something that made her blood run cold. He told her that other inmates were asking questions, that people knew, that he'd been trying to keep quiet, but the pressure was getting to him. And then, almost like a threat, he said, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this to myself." Patricia hung up without saying a word. She sat there in the dark, her hands shaking, her mind racing, and that's when she knew. Jerome had to go, not transferred, not relocated, gone, permanently. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. It was January 14th, a cold Monday night. The temperature had dropped to the low 30s, unusual for Alabama. Inside Limestone Correctional Facility, the heating system was barely working, and inmates huddled under thin blankets, their breath visible in the air. Jerome Davis was in his cell, reading a book by the dim light of the single bulb overhead. He'd been quiet for weeks, withdrawn. Other inmates had stopped talking to him. It was like he'd become a ghost, already half gone. At 10:47 p.m., according to security logs, Warden Patricia Hail entered cell block C. This wasn't unusual. She often did late-night inspections, but on this particular night she dismissed the guard on duty, telling him she'd handle the rounds herself. The guard, a young guy named Travis, who'd only been working there for 6 months, didn't question it. You don't question the warden. Patricia walked down the corridor, her footsteps echoing off the concrete. She stopped in front of cell 214. Jerome looked up and saw her standing there. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Patricia unlocked the cell and stepped inside. No one knows exactly what happened in the next 30 minutes. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just Patricia and Jerome, alone in that cell. But based on what investigators would later piece together, here's what likely occurred. Patricia confronted Jerome about the phone call, about the rumors, about the threat she believed he was holding over her. Jerome tried to defend himself, tried to explain that he wasn't going to say anything, that he just wanted to move on. But Patricia didn't believe him. She couldn't afford to believe him. At some point, the conversation turned physical. Maybe Jerome tried to leave the cell. Maybe Patricia blocked his way. Maybe he pushed her. Maybe she pushed back. But what started as an argument escalated into something much worse. Patricia had brought something with her that night, a small vial tucked in her jacket pocket. Sedatives, the kind used in the prison infirmary for inmates with severe anxiety or insomnia. She'd taken them from the medical supply room 2 days earlier. No one had noticed. She told Jerome she wanted to talk, that she wanted to make things right. She offered him water from a bottle she'd brought. Jerome, exhausted, emotionally drained, drank it. Within minutes, he started to feel dizzy. His vision blurred. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Patricia watched as he collapsed onto the floor, his breathing shallow, his eyes struggling to stay open. She stood over him for a long time, just watching, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The loneliness, the mistakes, the lies. And then, with hands that didn't shake, she wrapped her fingers around his throat. Not hard enough to leave obvious marks, just enough pressure, sustained pressure, to make sure he stopped breathing. Jerome tried to fight, but the sedatives had taken too much of his strength. His hands clawed weakly at her wrists. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, his body went still. Patricia released her grip. She stood up, smoothed out her uniform, and looked down at Jerome's lifeless body. Then she pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, a note she'd written earlier that day, and tucked it under his mattress. The note read, in handwriting that looked rushed, shaky, like someone in distress had written it, "I laughed at the wrong person." Patricia left the cell, locked it behind her, and walked calmly back to her office. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She just walked, like it was any other night. At 6:42 a.m. the next morning, during routine cell checks, a guard found Jerome Davis dead on the floor of cell 214. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His skin was cold. There was no blood, no obvious signs of trauma. Just a body lying there in the early morning light. The guard radioed for help. Within minutes, the cell was swarmed with staff, medics, and eventually, investigators from the Alabama Department of Corrections. The official preliminary report listed the cause of death as suicide by asphyxiation. The note found under the mattress was cited as evidence of suicidal intent. Case closed, or so it seemed. But one of the investigators, a man named Detective Ray Coleman, who'd been working prison cases for over 20 years, wasn't convinced. The note bothered him. The handwriting didn't match other samples of Jerome's writing. And the phrase itself, "I laughed at the wrong person," was too vague, too cryptic. It felt staged. Detective Coleman started asking questions. He requested the security footage from the night before. He interviewed guards. He examined Jerome's cell for any sign of a struggle, and the more he looked, the more things didn't add up. The security footage for cell block C on the night of January 14th was missing. Not corrupted, not damaged, missing. Someone had deliberately erased it from the system. Detective Coleman requested the access logs to see who had entered the security office that night. The logs showed that Warden Patricia Hail had accessed the system at 11:23 p.m., just 36 minutes after she'd entered Jerome's cell. When Coleman brought this to the attention of the Department of Corrections Internal Affairs Division, they told him to be careful. Patricia Hail was a respected warden with 15 years of service and a spotless record. Accusing her of anything without solid evidence would be career suicide. But Coleman didn't back down. He kept digging. He interviewed inmates in cell block C, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that night. Most of them refused to talk. Snitching in prison, even to help solve a murder, is a death sentence. But one inmate, Marcus, the same guy who'd warned Jerome weeks earlier, agreed to speak off the record. He told Coleman about the rumors, about the affair, about the night Patricia had stormed out of Jerome's cell looking like she wanted to kill someone. He didn't have proof, just whispers. But it was enough to make Coleman push harder. 2 weeks after Jerome's death, Coleman got a break. The prison infirmary reported that a vial of sedatives was missing from their inventory. The discrepancy had been noted on January 12th, 2 days before Jerome died. Coleman requested a toxicology report on Jerome's body, which had been standard procedure but hadn't been prioritized since the death was ruled a suicide. The results came back 3 weeks later. Traces of benzodiazepines were found in Jerome's system, enough to sedate him, but not enough to kill him. Combined with the bruising on his neck, which a more thorough autopsy revealed, the evidence pointed to homicide, not suicide. Coleman presented his findings to Internal Affairs. They opened a formal investigation into Patricia Hail. But by then, Patricia knew they were coming for her. She'd heard through the grapevine that Coleman was asking questions, that inmates were talking. She tried to stay calm, to maintain her routine, but the pressure was suffocating. She stopped sleeping. She lost weight. Her hands shook when she signed documents. Other staff members started to notice. Her deputy warden, a man named Frank who'd worked with her for 7 years, pulled her aside one afternoon and asked if she was okay. Patricia snapped at him, told him to mind his own business. Frank backed off, but he reported the interaction to Internal Affairs. They added it to their file. Then came the letter. A corrections officer doing a routine sweep of Jerome's belongings, which had been stored in an evidence locker pending the investigation, found a sealed envelope tucked inside one of Jerome's books. The envelope was addressed to the Governor of Alabama. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter, dated 2 weeks before Jerome's death. In it, Jerome detailed everything: the affair with Patricia, the late-night visits, the erased security footage, the fear he'd been living with, knowing that Patricia had the power to destroy him if she wanted to. He wrote about the phone call he'd made, the conversation where he'd tried to reason with her, and how she'd hung up without a word. The letter ended with a single sentence: "If something happens to me, she did it." The letter was a smoking gun, proof that Jerome had feared for his life. proof that Patricia had motive. Detective Coleman immediately requested a warrant for Patricia's arrest. But before the warrant could be executed, the letter disappeared from the evidence locker. Just gone. No one knew how, no one knew who. The officer who'd found it swore he'd logged it properly, but when Internal Affairs went to retrieve it, the locker was empty. Coleman was furious. He accused someone within the Department of Corrections of tampering with evidence, of protecting Patricia. But without the letter, his case was weaker. He still had the toxicology report. He still had witness testimony, but the letter had been the nail in the coffin, and now it was gone. For months, the investigation stalled. Patricia remained in her position as warden, though she was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the case. She hired a high-profile defense attorney, a woman named Rebecca Strauss, who specialized in criminal cases involving law enforcement. Rebecca's strategy was simple: paint Jerome as a manipulative inmate who'd seduced Patricia, then turned on her when she tried to end the relationship. The defense argued that Jerome had written the note himself, that he'd been suicidal, and that any relationship between him and Patricia had been consensual and had ended weeks before his death. It was a risky strategy, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, Detective Coleman refused to let the case die. He reached out to journalists, hoping media pressure would force the Department of Corrections to take the investigation seriously. And it worked. A local reporter named Sarah Mitchell picked up the story and ran with it. Her article, published in the Birmingham Herald, detailed the affair, the suspicious death, and the missing evidence. The story went viral. National news outlets picked it up. Suddenly, the case that the Department of Corrections had been trying to bury was front-page news across the country. Public pressure forced the Alabama Attorney General's office to take over the case. They assigned a special prosecutor, a no-nonsense former federal attorney named David Grant. Grant reviewed all the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and came to the same conclusion Coleman had months earlier: Patricia Hail had murdered Jerome Davis. In April, nearly 4 months after Jerome's death, Patricia was formally charged with first-degree murder, abuse of authority, and tampering with evidence. Her arrest made headlines. The image of her being led out of Limestone Correctional Facility in handcuffs, the same facility she'd once run with an iron fist, was broadcast on every major news network. The trial began in September. It lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was strong. They presented the toxicology report showing sedatives in Jerome's system. They presented testimony from the infirmary staff about the missing vial. They presented the access log showing Patricia had erased security footage. They presented testimony from Marcus and other inmates about the affair and the rumors that had spread through the prison. And they presented the officer's testimony about the letter, even though the letter itself was missing. The defense fought back hard. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof Patricia had killed Jerome. They presented character witnesses who testified to Patricia's professionalism and dedication. They argued that Jerome had been manipulative, that he'd preyed on Patricia's loneliness, and that when she'd tried to end things, he'd become obsessed and unstable. They even suggested that Jerome might have taken the sedatives himself, that his death could have been accidental or self-inflicted. But the prosecution had one more card to play. During the trial, a whistleblower came forward. A corrections officer named Lisa Chen, who'd worked the night shift at Limestone, testified that she'd seen Patricia near cell block C on the night of Jerome's death. Lisa had been too afraid to come forward earlier, fearing retaliation. But once the trial started, once she saw Patricia sitting in that courtroom trying to get away with it, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Lisa testified that she'd seen Patricia leaving Jerome's cell around 11:15 p.m. She'd thought it was strange, but she hadn't said anything at the time. She testified that Patricia had looked shaken, her uniform disheveled, her face pale. The defense tried to discredit Lisa, suggesting she had a grudge against Patricia. But Lisa's testimony was consistent, detailed, and believable. The jury found her credible. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, family members. Jerome's mother, a woman named Carol Davis, who'd been sitting in the front row every single day of the trial, clutched her sister's hand as the jury foreman stood up, guilty on all counts. Patricia showed no emotion. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, as the judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. 2 months later, Patricia Hail was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12. The judge, a woman named Margaret Holloway who'd been on the bench for 30 years, didn't mince words during sentencing. She told Patricia that she'd betrayed every principle of justice, that she'd used her power to exploit a vulnerable person, and that when that person became inconvenient, she'd eliminated him. Judge Holloway said that Patricia's actions had not only destroyed Jerome's life and devastated his family, but it also damaged the integrity of the entire correction system. As Patricia was led out of the courtroom, Carol Davis stood up. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just looked Patricia in the eyes and said quietly, "I hope you never know peace." Patricia was sent to a women's correctional facility in southern Alabama, the same system she'd once helped run. She served 12 years before being granted parole. Today she lives in a small town in Georgia under an assumed name. She works at a grocery store. She keeps to herself, and according to those who know her, she never talks about what happened, never mentions Jerome, never mentions Limestone. It's like that part of her life has been erased, locked away in a cell she can never escape. Jerome Davis was buried in his hometown of Mobile. His funeral was attended by family, a few childhood friends, and Detective Ray Coleman, who'd worked tirelessly to bring Patricia to justice. Jerome's mother, Carol, spoke at the service. She talked about the boy Jerome had been before prison, before mistakes, before that gas station robbery changed everything. She talked about his smile, his kindness, his dreams of going back to school, and she talked about how the system that was supposed to rehabilitate him had instead become the place where he died. The case sparked a larger conversation about abuse of power in prisons, about the lack of oversight, about the vulnerability of inmates and the people tasked with watching over them. Reforms were proposed. Some were implemented, but for the most part, the system stayed the same. Cell 214 at Limestone Correctional Facility was left empty for months after Jerome's death. Eventually, another inmate was assigned there. But the story of what happened in that cell, the affair, the betrayal, the murder, it became prison legend. Inmates still talk about it. Guards still whisper about it. And every once in a while, when the lights go out and the facility falls silent, someone will walk past cell 214 and wonder what really happened that January night. What thoughts went through Patricia's mind? What Jerome's last moments were like? Whether he knew, in those final seconds, that the person he'd trusted was the one taking his life. So let me ask you something. As you've listened to this story, as you've heard about Jerome and Patricia, about the affair, the humiliation, the murder, what do you feel? Do you feel sympathy for Patricia, a woman so consumed by loneliness that she destroyed her own life? Do you feel anger at Jerome, who knew what he was doing, who knew the power dynamics at play and used them to his advantage? Or do you just feel sad? Sad that two people made choices that led to one of them dying alone on a cold cell floor and the other spending over a decade behind bars? Think about it. Really think about it. Because this isn't just a story about a warden and an inmate. It's a story about power, about loneliness, about the lies we tell ourselves when we're desperate for connection, about how quickly shame can turn to rage and rage to violence. Patricia Hail wasn't a monster. She was a human being who made catastrophic choices. Jerome Davis wasn't a saint. He was a flawed man trying to survive in an unforgiving system, and what happened between them, it destroyed them both. Now imagine for a second that you were in Patricia's position. Imagine you'd spent 15 years building a career, sacrificing relationships, convincing yourself you didn't need anyone, and then someone comes along, someone who makes you feel seen, feel wanted, for the first time in years. Would you have the strength to walk away, Or would you, like Patricia, let your guard down and cross that line? And then imagine that person laughs at you in your most vulnerable moment. How would you feel? Humiliated? Betrayed? Angry enough to make sure they could never hurt you again? Or imagine you were Jerome. You're locked up, years left on your sentence, surrounded by violence and despair. And then someone with power, someone who can make your life easier or harder with a single decision, shows interest in you. Do you reject them and risk retaliation? Or do you go along with it, tell yourself it's not that bad, maybe even convince yourself there's something real there? And when things go wrong, when you realize you've made a mistake, do you have any way out? Any way to protect yourself? These are the questions this case forces us to confront. There are no easy answers, no clear villains or heroes, just people making choices, and those choices having consequences. Jerome Davis is gone. He'll never get a second chance, never get to finish his sentence and rebuild his life. Patricia Hail is out on parole, but she's a convicted murderer. That label will follow her forever. And the system, the one that allowed this to happen, that failed to protect Jerome and failed to stop Patricia, it's still operating the same way today. Thousands of inmates, hundreds of facilities, and countless opportunities for power to be abused, for lines to be crossed, for tragedies like this to happen again. So what do we do with a story like this? Do we write it off as an isolated incident, a rare case of things going horribly wrong? Or do we see it as a symptom of a larger problem, a system that values control over compassion, punishment over rehabilitation? I think the answer is both. This case is unique in its details, but the dynamics at play, the loneliness, the power imbalance, the lack of accountability, those exist in prisons across the country. And until we address those underlying issues, stories like Jerome and Patricia's will keep happening. Now, before we close out, I want to know what you think. Do you believe Patricia deserved the sentence she got? Do you think Jerome bears any responsibility for what happened? And most importantly, if you were on that jury, would you have voted guilty? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to hear your perspective on this.